Hello everybody, Intuition here. Today we would like to discuss certain aspects that have been left out of the Bible, and as they have been left out of the Bible, they've caused much misinterpretation of the scriptures that were left behind originally to help aid, guide, and assist us in our evolutionary process, but because they have been doctored, they have been rewritten and remastered many times, they have lost much of their meaning as we have only saw importance in the words and not really understanding the messaging of what it is that they represent and why it is that they were left here to begin with. First and foremost, one of the things that we lose sight of, that we quickly stumble and move past over, is the idea that the Bible was written originally in 3 different languages: Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. And that is to give light, give credence to the different understandings at the time that we're writing the Bible. And it gives light to the Holy Trinity, as if you have read the Bible, they speak much about. But if that is such a big part of the Bible, and it was written in 3 languages, therefore to allude to symbolize, to show more of an understanding of what the Holy Trinity means, why was that left out of the Bible? Why is it only important for us to see that it is written in our native tongue and language, besides the fact that it has been rewritten many, many times by many, many different people to help serve the agenda of people in power at that time? But that is another conversation, as many of you, I'm sure, already are in awareness of that. The Bible and many religious scripts across the board have been used to serve an agenda to help those in power control the masses. And it is through twisting some of the words within what it was written in the Bible that then therefore distort the actual message that has been able to continue to occur for millennia. But we would like to restore some of what it is the original meaning is, based off of what it is that we're able to intuit. So the first thing that is very important for you to understand is the meaning of God itself, because God is one of the most misunderstood characters in the whole damn Bible. So what is God? And please, for God's sake, don't get lost in us saying God. Don't get lost in the words. If you don't like the word God, if you got issues with God, then whatever word suits you best. God really doesn't care what you call God, because God isn't really God's name to begin with. So you already got it wrong the first time, or the 10th time, since this book has been rewritten many times. So call God whatever the hell you want. Doesn't really matter. The message is what matters. So God is not the God that you know. God, first and foremost, is a universal principality. God is representative of something. God represents and holds together the fabric of all it is, all that is. And if you want to just call that God, then that is a very simplistic, silly understanding, because God is so much more than just the word, the frame, the understanding of God. God is a universal principality that is holding the fabric of every universe, of every understanding, of every knowing, of every possibility together. And so, then therefore, that means that God is the universal principality that is beyond and above. But God, like us, as above, so below, is always evolving. God has not just been the same God since the beginning of God's time. God has gone through their own evolutionary process and growth and understanding their self, themself, his self, herself, whatever. So before we, us, came to be, when it was just God chilling with God, just all God all day, God was the universal principality associated with knowing all. God was all-knowing. God still is all-knowing. But that was the representative principle that God was. That was what God mastered. So God mastered knowing all. And once you master your universal principality, you get kind of bored because you've mastered it. And especially if you're the universal principality that is all-knowing. That's exceptionally boring and upsetting, because once you master it, you know everything. Nothing is a surprise. You know what this is, you know what that is. Nothing will ever be new to you. And so one day, after God had really been sitting there for God knows how long, knowing all that God could know, God wondered, well, what else can I be? I'm curious what else I can understand myself as. And as soon as God had that thought, we exploded forth from God. And God then therefore became the next universal principality in the evolutionary growth, which is the God of curiosity, the universal principality that is curiosity, because that is the next stage. When you go from all-knowing, then the next stage and state would be all-curious, which then therefore restores and renews, breathes life into you knowing all, because when you are curious, you could still know it all, but still there is a curiosity that allows life to begin to emanate from you. And so why I'm going into this is because it's important to fact check something. And that is, we are not God's children. We are a symptom of God in God's evolutionary process of growth. God did not sit in their all-knowingness and say, I wonder what it would be like to have children. Because we would be very different if we were God's children. God said, air quotes said, God didn't say anything, but better for you to understand. God said, well, I wonder what it would be like to be more of myself, what it would be like to expand outside of what it is that I know. And then we exploded forth from God. So, don't know if you've read the Bible. Don't know if you've picked the book up. It's a big book, so we don't blame you. They would like to have you believe, we are not even sure because it's been written a million times, but they would like you to believe that you are God's child, and that is, again, farthest from the truth. And if you believe, the problem with believing that you are God's child is this. If you believe that you are God's child, then that means that God is an authority over you. And God can never be an authority over you based off of what it is that we just said. What it is that we just said, to recap, is God became curious about all that God could be, and we exploded off of God. God did not get pregnant and then give birth to hundreds of millions of thousands of universal principalities. No. God became curious, and when God became curious, we blew off of God. Some of us came from God's shoulder. Some of us came from God's head. Some of us came from God's foot. Some of us came from God's ass. So all of us blew off of an aspect of God, which means God did not give birth to us. We moved from God into our own space. Because again, we are not God's children. We are an aspect of God. We are an extension of God. So if you believe that you are God's child, then that is taking away your own birthright, if you want to call it that. It is taking away your own understanding of yourself. Because God did not give birth to you. You are God. You are an extension of God. If I cut off my arm and then threw it over there, I wouldn't say I gave birth to that arm. I would say that arm that was mine is now over there. And it is still mine. It's still my arm, but now it can have its own consciousness. It could have its own understanding. I wouldn't say I just gave birth to my arm when I cut it off of me and then threw it. So it is the same understanding. And the reason, again, why it's important to understand that is because when you say that I am God's child, you are getting in the way of God's curiosity. And you don't want to get in the way of God. And anytime you think that something is an authority over you, which cannot ever be because you are an extension of God, God can't be an authority over God, the aspect of God that you just blew off of. Once I cut off my arm again and then throw it over there, I kind of lose the autonomy that I had over my arm. I can't say, hey arm, now that you're cut, and you're hanging over there. Can you come over here? No. That thing is now autonomous from me, not because it's my child, but because it came from me. I threw it over there, and now it's its own thing. And it's its own thing, then therefore it can explore whatever it wants, not because of free will, but because it's an aspect of God. And it has its own identity, because when it was attached to God, not that it didn't have its own identity, but when you separate it, when I cut off my arm and throw it over there, now it really has its own identity. It's completely separate, as opposed to when it was attached to my arm, it was attached to a body. Not that it didn't have its own identity attached to the body, but it really has its own being now that it's thrown over there separate from me. So when you believe that you're God's child, all kinds of crazy crap gets in the way. And the biggest thing that gets in the way is you getting in the way of God's curiosity. Because what you start to do is, well, I'm God's child, and I must be devoted to God, and I'm going to do all the things for God, and I'm going to live my life for God, and I'm going to give myself to God. And God doesn't want you all up in God's space. That is why God cut us off and threw us over there. If God wanted you right back home, we wouldn't have left. And again, the reason why we left is simply because God wanted to evolve and become more of God's self. But if you keep on getting God's way and saying, well, I want to live my life for God, I want to be in service to God, God is the authority in my life, and I am just the pauper that gets to be the slave to God. No, no, no. You consistently shut yourself down and don't realize that you are an extension of God because you came off of God, not because you were God's child, but because you are God. Not the OG God, but you are still God. And if you can't see that and you're just living your life in a devotional tomb to God, you're not going anywhere. You're not evolving. You're not allowing God to be the curious God that God is, that allows God to see all that God can see, be all that God could be. You're just getting in the way. And so, it is important to know that and understand that, because these religious texts do not lend to that understanding. These religious texts tell you, oh, well, God is an authority in your life, and God's crazy, God's super judgy, so you got to make sure you do X, Y, and Z. You have to, you must, you need to. No meat on Sunday. You can't go and do X, Y, and Z. Whatever it is that your religious text is telling you. But again, God doesn't judge. You're an extension of God. To judge, for God to judge you would mean that God is judging themselves. God doesn't judge themselves. God isn't the God of judgment. God is the God of curiosity. And if God were to judge you, God would be getting in the way of their curiosity. And when you judge others for living their life in a way that goes against God, which you have no idea about because you don't even know the true God, you just read about God, get lost in the words and not understand the messaging, then you are promoting more of a separation that does not allow God to be all that God can be, does not allow you to be all that you can be, because God needs you to be all that you can be so that you can go off and explore and be the curiosity that God is. But you're not allowing yourself to do that. If you're sitting in a devotional tomb, if you are judging other people for not living exactly the way the scripture says, the scripture was written because other individuals had influence and their own agenda put into the scripture so that it looks a certain way so that people in power could still be in power. But we invite you to think about these things, because again, God does not care in that way for you to be devoted. Well, if you must be devoted to yourself and understanding that you are an extension of God. And being an extension of God means that every piece of God is going to be different. Again, some pieces of us exploded from the shoulder. Some pieces of us exploded from the toe. So you can't be the piece of God that exploded from the shoulder and look over at the other piece of God that exploded from the toe and say, I just don't like how that piece of God is living over there. Well, who are you? You don't know. That piece of God is representative of the toe. And you're representative of the shoulder. You don't understand because you are not that aspect of God. And God doesn't need you to understand that because you're the shoulder, they're the toe. The toe is going to be curious about things and explore things for God in a way that the toe needs to explore. You are going to explore things in the way that you need to explore based off of your predisposition that the shoulder is. So it is the idea that we are all extensions of God. None of us are children. All of us are very much autonomous adults. And when you stop being you, when you start going into this fabrication of I'm a child and there's an authority over me and that is God and God is the adult, you literally stop both of your evolutionary growths, God and yours, because you are no longer realizing that you are an aspect of God and that you can do whatever you want, whatever you need to, whatever you want to explore is yours to explore because that allows God to explore it. When you say, I'm a child of God, you stop understanding yourself. You start judging other aspects, other universal principalities that are also a part of God in such a heinous, nasty way that does not allow anybody to evolve. It allows everybody to stay stuck and does not allow us to be all that we can be and why we exploded off of God to begin with. Because again, we're a symptom, not the intention of God having children. We're a symptom of God's evolution. And when we remember that, we can remember all it is that we are, live autonomously, independently, freely, without judgment, and really recognize that we are all one because we come from the one. And there is no judgment in any one being different. That is the point of all of us being different, of all of us exploring different things. And you are not anybody to judge because when you judge, you are judging another aspect of God, which means you're judging not only God, yourself, and that other person. You're creating a negative Holy Trinity. So, food for thought. If you disagree, we applaud you, we encourage you. Please, we invite you to disagree all day. Find something that makes sense to you so that you can not live in devotion and in service, but to live in the remembrance and the knowing of all it is that you can be. That is all we are wanting to impart to you at this time. So, as always, we wish you well and we thank you for making time and space for us. And may you remember God, if you want to call God that, but more importantly, most importantly, God could care less if you remember God, as long as you remember yourself. Because when you remember yourself, God gets to know more of itself. Thank you and well wishes.